a service of CandC Worldwide.
One of the rules of journalism is that when a great disaster strikes, reporters and editors look for the local connections. If the local connections turn out to be survivors, then they try for interviews. That was also the rule 100 years ago when AP bulletins began crossing news desks announcing that Titanic had struck an iceberg and was lost. This is Rochester. There are always Rochester connections, and Titanic is no different. The city's papers found at least 3 survivors and 1 lost, and it was papers in that day, including the Democrat and Chronicle. But 2 of those survivors never told their stories to the press while they were alive, and the 3rd didn't speak of it for almost 20 years. It was the man who was lost who made the headlines as a dispute broke out over who got to claim his body. Well, first the recap. 100 years ago, late on the night of April 14th, 1912, the White Star Line's Royal Mail steamship Titanic was bound for New York on her maiden voyage across the North Atlantic. It was a perfectly clear night. They'd altered the usual course further to the south because other ships had been sending ice warnings. Apparently confident with that precaution, her captain went to bed. Titanic's officers followed the custom of the day by running full ahead. Several of them had in fact evaded icebergs in other ships. But Titanic was nearly twice the size of most other liners afloat, and nobody had appreciated how much longer it would take her to turn. If you've seen either the 1958 classic Night to Remember or director James Cameron's 1997 Titanic, you know how this turns out. This is Cameron's version that you're looking at. He had a lot more budget to work with, and he literally recreated Titanic and her bridge from the original blueprints. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee spotting the iceberg low in the water directly in front of Titanic's bow. First Officer William Murdoch ordering hard a starboard and the engines to full astern. The weight measured by later experiment with Titanic's sister ship Olympic at 37 seconds as the bow slowly begins to turn away from the iceberg, almost, but not far enough. The slight jar through the 66,000-ton, 880-foot-long ship as her starboard side scrapes along the berg. The growing realization confirmed by her builder, Thomas Andrews, who was along for the maiden voyage, that the impact has buckled hull plates and popped rivets along more than 1/3 of the ship's length. The Titanic can float with 4 of her first 5 watertight compartments open to the sea, but not with all 5. That despite her remaining watertight bulkheads, the ship will sink within as little as 2 hours. That there are 2,207 souls on board and room in the lifeboats for 1,178. And Titanic actually carries more lifeboats than the outdated British Board of Trade regulations required. The first wireless call for help going out at 12:15 on the morning of the 15th. The first lifeboat lowered at 12:45. Less than half full, passengers refusing to enter because the ship seemed so much safer. Titanic breaking in half and foundering at 2:20 a.m. The Cunard Company liner Carpathia arriving on scene an hour and 10 minutes later. An estimated 1,503 lost. On board the Titanic that night was second-class passenger Lillian Bentham, originally of Holly, but bound for Rochester. Her family had moved to the city while she was visiting Europe. According to the website Encyclopedia Titanica and a 1912 New York Times article, the 19-year-old Miss Bentham was one of many that night who didn't believe the ship was sinking. As a result, she almost didn't make it. She told the Democrat and Chronicle in 1931, although the passengers were being taken off in the lifeboats, I did not think the Titanic was going to sink. It was so big, so magnificent, that I did not think it possible. I had gone to my stateroom, and it was just before the last of 12 lifeboats put off that one of the young men in my party rushed to my stateroom and told me to hurry on deck, that the ship was going down. In that 1931 interview with the Democrat and Chronicle, Bentham said her friend got her to the boat deck just as number 12, the last boat to make it away, was ready to lower. She said, I reached the deck with him just in time to get into the boat before it was lowered from the davits. I recall that the officer on deck shouted to the seaman in charge of the lifeboat to pull away quickly, that the Titanic was going down and the suction would pull us under. A man jumped from an upper deck and landed in our boat just as we pulled away. Bentham's benefactor did not survive, but she reached the Carpathia and New York. Lillian Bentham married John Black 6 years after surviving the disaster. They settled down at 11K Terrace in Rochester. She died shortly before Christmas in 1977 and is buried in Hillside Cemetery in Holly. The photo from the Encyclopedia Titanica shows her in 1955. Also aboard Titanic that night were Ethel and Edward Bean of Rochester, or rather soon to be of Rochester. They were one of a dozen couples known to be honeymooning on the first voyage of the world's biggest steamer. The photo is from a 1931 Democrat and Chronicle article written on the 20th anniversary of the disaster. Edward Bean lived in Rochester before he went back to England to bring home his bride. They married a few days before the voyage, and they were also traveling second class when the order came to take to the boats. Mr. Bean saw his wife into a boat. He stayed behind with most of the male passengers. He jumped from the slanting deck as Titanic's bow dipped beneath the sea, and he became one of just a handful of people who were pulled from the water into a lifeboat and thus saved. One source says that because they reached Carpathia separately, neither learned that the other had been saved until the rescue ship reached New York. Another source disputes that and says both were rescued in the same boat. Whichever is the case, the Beans settled back in Rochester. Edward Bean was the only survivor among the 12 bridegrooms on board. He never spoke of what happened in the disaster except to members of his own family, and he maintained that policy until he died in 1948. He's buried at Whitehaven Memorial Park in Parenton. Ethel Bean outlived her husband by 35 years and was one of the last living survivors when she died in the fall of 1983 at a Rochester nursing home. She was 90. She gave one interview shortly after reaching New York, saying she had seen members of the Titanic's crew holding men back at gunpoint from the lifeboats. According to the interview, she said she had seen one man shot. From then until her death, she followed her husband's policy, and she never spoke of the disaster again, except with family. Our final Titanic story comes from the Epitaph, the newsletter of the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery, which got it from family sources and Rochester historian Don Schilling. It's the story of Stanley Fox of Gregory Street. He was a salesman for Gleason Works, and he was on his way home from a successful business trip to England. Like the other Rochesterians on board, he was traveling second class. He celebrated his 38th birthday on board 3 days out from Southampton. When the collision came, Fox was playing cards with friends in the second-class smoking room. They kept at it until it became clear something was actually wrong. We don't know much about his actions after that, except that he chose to stay aboard. He wasn't as fortunate as Edward Bean. His body was found in the sea by one of several ships that White Star chartered to recover as many of the dead as they could bring in. His remains were found, identified by his personal effects, and brought to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where a temporary morgue had been set up to receive them. A telegram went from White Star to Mrs. Cora Fox at their Gregory Street home. The news sent her into shock, and she wasn't able to travel. And that's where things got weird. A woman identifying herself as Lydia Fox, claiming to be Stanley Fox's sister-in-law, arrived in Halifax and claimed the body. She said she was acting on behalf of Fox's widow. The coroner and the agents of White Star were convinced. At her request, they had the body put on a train to be shipped to Lydia Fox's hometown. For some reason, his possessions were left behind at the White Star office. Shortly after the train carrying Lydia Fox and the body of Stanley Fox left Halifax, a telegram was received at a station down the line. It ordered the train crew to put the body off there and turn it over to the authorities. Lydia Fox was suspected of stealing the body in order to commit insurance fraud. She was eventually allowed to continue on her way, but empty-handed. Cora Fox had gotten a telegram to the Canadian authorities. She allegedly knew Lydia Fox, but refused to allow her any claim on either her husband's body or personal effects. So the body of Stanley Fox was held by Canadian authorities until Rochester Mayor Hiram Edgerton confirmed the true ownership of the body and sent a telegram to Canadian authorities directing them to release the body and send it to his widow. Stanley Fox's remains were finally shipped to a funeral chapel in Rochester, and he was then interred a month after the disaster in Mount Hope Cemetery. These images, by the way, are from old Pathé newsreels, and they actually show Olympic, Titanic's sister ship. The studios, when they realized Titanic had sunk, grabbed this stock footage of Titanic's sister ship Olympic on her maiden voyage, quickly relabeled it, and shoved it out into the newsreel theaters. And that, I guess, is another form of journalism that you can sometimes still find practiced today. 4 Rochester links with Titanic 100 years ago. I'm Bud Lowell.